The room was big enough to hold a small city inside it. That was not an exaggeration. The Grand Conclave Hall sat at the center of Station Meridian, a space platform so large that it had its own weather near the ceiling. Clouds sometimes drifted near the top of the dome. Rain had fallen inside the hall once, during a particularly long session 300 years ago. No one who was alive then remembered it now, but the record was kept. The Galactic Accord kept records of everything. Ambassador Serena Voss walked through the main doors of the hall at exactly the time she was supposed to. She was a tall woman with short gray hair and dark eyes that had the habit of noticing things before other people did. She wore the standard blue uniform of Earth's diplomatic service, pressed and clean, and completely without decoration. Some ambassadors wore medals or pins or colored sashes. Serena wore none of those things. She had always believed that if you needed extra things on your clothes to get people to take you seriously, then you had already lost. She took her seat at the human delegation table. It was a small table. Earth had always been given a small table at the conclave, placed near the back of the curved chamber, far from the raised central platform where the senior species sat. The Vreth had a table near the front. So did the Luthari, and the Kalan, and the old, slow Orenti, who had been members of the Accord for 9,000 years. Humanity had been members for less than 200. In galactic terms, that made humans roughly equivalent to a child who had just learned to walk. The hall filled slowly. 47 species, each with their own delegation, their own table, their own quiet conversations in their own languages. The translation devices built into every seat turned all of it into a low, constant hum of meaning. Serena had stopped noticing the hum years ago. It was just part of the air in places like this. She already knew what was going to happen today. She had known for 3 weeks, ever since a junior diplomat from the Luthari delegation had quietly pulled her aside in a corridor and told her, in a voice barely above a whisper, that a motion had been prepared. The Luthari diplomat had looked uncomfortable telling her this. Serena had thanked him and walked away without changing her expression at all. Archon Velthari called the session to order. He was the lead delegate of the Vreth, and he was very old, even by Vreth standards. His skin was the pale blue-gray of deep ocean water, and his 4 eyes moved independently, which humans tended to find unsettling. He spoke in the slow, careful way of someone who had learned long ago that the slower you spoke, the more important people assumed your words were. This session of the Grand Conclave is called for a single matter. His voice came through the translation device as smooth and level as a stone floor. The matter of the human species and their continued membership in the Galactic Accord. There was a ripple through the room. Not quite a sound, more like a shared breath that everyone took at the same moment. Serena sat still. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her. She was watching Velthari, but she was also watching the other tables, without appearing to do so. Velthari laid out the case carefully. He was good at this. He had been doing it for a long time. The charges against humanity were not new. They had been said before, in smaller rooms, in private conversations, in the quiet corridors between sessions. But today, they were being said in public, on the record, in the hall where 47 species could hear every word. They had entered 3 armed conflicts in their first 50 years as Accord members, 2 of which they had started themselves. They adapted too fast, biologically, technologically, culturally. In the time it took most species to develop 1 new piece of technology, humans developed 9, and then immediately started arguing about whether those technologies were good ideas. They were unpredictable. Their politics changed so fast that making long-term agreements with them was like trying to build a house on water. They were loud. They were restless. They asked too many questions and accepted too few answers. The Veth motion, Velthari said, reaching the end of his long speech, calls for the formal removal of the human species from the Galactic Accord. Full exile, a clean separation, for the safety and stability of all member civilizations. One by one, the delegation spoke. Some were long, some were short. Some simply said they agreed with the Vreth without adding anything new. A few spoke about specific incidents. The border dispute near Kepler 442. The trade crisis of 2189. The time a human research ship had accidentally disrupted a Kalan religious ceremony by broadcasting loud music while passing through their system. That last one had been an accident, and the human pilot had apologized 7 times. It was still brought up at least once every major session. Serena listened to all of it. She did not react visibly to any of it. A junior diplomat from her own team leaned over once and whispered, "Do you want to respond to the Kalan point?" She shook her head once, slowly. The Secretary General of the Accord, a Luthari named Ronak, called for the vote. He was a thin, angular being with long fingers and a face that always looked slightly worried. He had been Secretary General for 40 years. Serena thought he was fundamentally a decent being who was caught in an impossible position, and she did not hold what was happening against him personally. She had told him this privately, in the corridor, before the session began. He had looked at her with those worried eyes and said, quietly, "I am sorry, Ambassador." She had nodded and said, "I know." The vote went around the room, table by table, delegation by delegation. The translation devices announced each result in every language simultaneously. In favor of Exile. In favor. In favor. In favor. The Luthari abstained. Their delegate looked at the table when the record was taken. The small, quiet pet species also abstained. They were a gentle people who preferred not to commit to things that might hurt someone. Humanity voted against. The final count was 44 in favor, 2 abstentions, 1 against. The motion passed. It was official. Humanity was no longer a member of the Galactic Accord. Effective immediately, by the rules of the Accord's own charter, all rights, privileges, trade agreements, and diplomatic protections attached to human membership were dissolved. Secretary General Ronak announced the result in a voice that tried to be official and mostly succeeded. There was a sound in the room after he finished. Not a cheer. Something quieter and less comfortable than a cheer. The sound of 44 species who had just done something they had convinced themselves was necessary and were now waiting to see if they felt better. Serena Voss stood up. The room noticed. When someone stands up after a vote like that, it usually means they're going to argue. They're going to protest or appeal or demand that the record show their objection. Every eye and visual organ and sensor array in the hall turned toward the small human table at the back. She walked to the podium at the center of the floor. Her footsteps were quiet on the smooth material of the hall. She stood at the podium and looked out at the room for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough for everyone to get a good look. Then she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the kind of smile that appears on the face of someone who has just been told something they already knew. A quiet smile. A settled smile. The smile of a person who has had a plan for a long time and has just watched the first part of it complete exactly as expected. "Very well," she said. Her voice was calm. It went through the translation devices and came out calm in 47 languages. "We accept your decision." She paused for exactly 1 second. "We'll see ourselves out." She picked up her datapad from the podium, tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the main doors of the hall. She did not look back. Her pace was the same steady, unhurried pace it had been when she walked in. The doors of the Grand Conclave Hall opened as she approached. She walked through them. They closed behind her, with a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the hall like a slow wave. In the silence that followed, no one spoke for a long time. Archon Velthari sat very still at the Vreth table near the front. His 4 eyes, which usually moved independently, were all pointed at the closed doors. Secretary General Ronak looked down at his notes, as if there was something written there that could explain what he had just seen. The Luthari delegate, who had warned Serena 3 weeks ago, pressed his long fingers together and stared at nothing. It was a young aide from the Kalan delegation who finally said what several people in the room were thinking. He said it quietly, to the senior delegate beside him, but the translation devices were still active, and his words carried. "She didn't look upset," he said. The senior Kalan delegate did not answer. There was no good answer to give. The aide was right. Serena Voss had not looked upset. She had not looked frightened, or angry, or sad, or desperate, or any of the things that a person was supposed to look like when everything they were part of had just been taken away. She had looked like someone who had just finished waiting. 6 months after the vote, the office of Admiral Dara Okonkwo looked like a war room. Maps covered most of the walls. Not maps of enemy positions or battle lines. Maps of supply chains, shipping routes, relay beacon networks, and trade corridors. The kind of maps that a military person puts on their walls when the battle they are fighting is not a shooting war, that's something more complicated, and in the long run, more important. Admiral Okonkwo was a broad-shouldered woman, with close-cropped hair, and the kind of face that had spent too many years in low gravity, and come out looking comfortable with it. She had served in 3 branches of Earth's defense forces before being handed command of what was now being called the Human Sovereign Fleet. She had accepted the promotion with less celebration than most people expected. Her aide had asked if she wanted to mark the occasion somehow. She had said no. There was too much work to do. "Beacon network status," she said without looking up from the table in front of her. The officer to her left checked his screen. 14 of our own relay beacons are now fully operational. They cover all major transit corridors inside human space. The Accord network beacons have been taken offline on our end. Ships have been rerouted. Good. She made a mark on her map. Trade routes? Director Cassis's team confirms that the last 3 supply dependencies on Accord member systems have been replaced. The agricultural contracts with the Kalan were the hardest to close out. We had to spin up 2 new growing operations on Kepler 62F, but they're running ahead of schedule, Okonkwo said, not unkindly. It was just a fact she had observed many times. Director Yun Cassis arrived 12 minutes later, slightly out of breath from moving quickly through the station's corridors. He was a small, precise man who ran the Bureau of Severance, an agency that had not existed 18 months ago, and now employed over 4,000 people. His job was, in the simplest terms, to cut every thread that connected humanity to the Galactic Accord, and to make sure that when the last thread was cut, humanity did not fall. He had been preparing for this job for 30 years. He had simply not been allowed to say so out loud until now. "The Threshold Project reports full readiness," he said, sitting down and opening his own display. "Ruiz is requesting final authorization for activation. He says the boundary array is in position. All 1,412 nodes are active and synchronized." Okonkwo looked at the star map on the wall. Around the rough shape of human-controlled space, a ragged, spreading cluster of settled systems stretching out from Sol, a line had been drawn. It was not a physical wall. It was something more elegant than that. "Tell him he has authorization," she said. On a research platform near the edge of human space, Dr. Emiliano Ruiz received the authorization code at 0340 station time. He had been awake for 21 hours. He did not feel tired. He had been working toward this moment for most of his adult life, and the particular kind of energy that comes from finally arriving somewhere you have been walking toward for a very long time does not care much about how many hours you have been awake. He did not make speeches to his team before pressing the activation command. He simply checked the readiness board one final time, confirmed that all nodes were green, and entered the command sequence. The threshold barrier activated quietly, the way truly large things often do. There was no visible light, no sound, no dramatic flash. 1,200 sensors across human space registered the quantum lock field, settling into position, like a key turning in a very large lock. From outside, the effect would be different. The entire border of human space would appear, to any scanning system, as a wall of sensor interference. Not opaque, not aggressive, just unreadable. Like trying to see through frosted glass. "Threshold is active," a technician said. Dr. Ruiz nodded once. "Lock it." Locked. We don't have to answer. The thing that the Galactic Accord did not understand, and this was perhaps the most important thing they did not understand, was that humanity had been quietly, carefully, and very patiently building toward independence for a long time. The Exile vote had not caused any of this. It had simply given official permission for what was already almost complete. The Bureau of Severance had started as a small, unofficial planning group inside Earth's government about 32 years earlier. Its original members were a handful of strategists, economists, and engineers who had looked at humanity's position in the Galactic Accord and reached a quiet conclusion. The relationship was not going to last. The Accord was built around species that evolved slowly, changed slowly, and were made deeply uncomfortable by things that did not evolve slowly and change slowly. Humanity was, by any measure, the most uncomfortable thing the Accord had ever admitted to membership. It was only a matter of time before the discomfort became official. So the group had started planning. Not for war, not for defiance, for something simpler and harder and ultimately more powerful: self-sufficiency. The slow, quiet work of building everything you need so that when someone tries to take things away from you, there is nothing left for them to take. New supply chains, built through human-controlled worlds. New trade networks, running entirely inside human space. New communications infrastructure, new medical supply lines, new educational programs designed to make sure that every critical piece of knowledge humans had ever gotten from Accord member species was now known by humans too. The Accord's shared databases had been quietly, legally, and thoroughly copied over the course of 2 decades. New relay beacons had been built and placed and tested. New ship drives, better ones, as it turned out, because once human engineers were no longer required to share their work with the Accord's Technology Oversight Board, they stopped holding back. Had been developed in the last 8 years and deployed across the fleet. And the Threshold Project. That had been the longest work of all. A complete sensor and quantum lock boundary system enclosing all of human space. Not a weapon. A door. A very large, very solid door with a handle only on the inside. The Accord's member species watched all of this happen and were deeply confused by it. They had expected chaos. When you remove a species from the greatest cooperative civilization in the known galaxy, the reasonable expectation is that they will struggle. Trade will dry up. Technology will stagnate without shared research. Isolated and cut off, they will eventually come back, asking for reinstatement on whatever terms are offered. That was how it had worked the 3 other times the Accord had exiled a species. Each time, within 20 years, the exiled species had petitioned for readmission. Humanity had not petitioned for readmission. Humanity had spent 6 months packing up its offices, canceling its subscriptions, forwarding its mail, and quietly activating a backup civilization it had been building in secret for 30 years. On the day the last human diplomatic vessel departed Accord space, a supply ship, technically, finishing up a final cargo run, its captain sent a single, brief communication to the nearest Accord relay station. The message was, "Transit complete, returning home." Then, the ship crossed the threshold, and the barrier sealed behind it. The captain's name was Yemi Torres. She was 29 years old. She had grown up hearing about the Galactic Accord the way people talk about a difficult neighbor, someone you have to deal with, someone whose rules you have to follow, someone who never quite lets you forget that they were here first. When the barrier sealed behind her ship, she stood at the observation deck and watched the stars on the other side for a moment. Then she turned around and looked at the stars in front of her. Human stars, human space, everything ahead. "Let's go," she said to no one in particular, and walked back to the bridge. In the offices of the Galactic Accord, on Station Meridian, the communications director filed the first in what would become a long series of unusual reports. Human traffic had stopped. Not reduced. Stopped. The relay beacons that had once carried constant streams of human commercial and diplomatic communications had gone quiet overnight. Several Accord member species, who had ongoing business with human companies, reported that their contacts had simply stopped responding. Not with a refusal, just silence. "It is as if," the communications director wrote in her report, choosing her words very carefully, "they have simply stepped through a door and closed it behind them." She filed the report and waited for someone senior to tell her what it meant. No one could tell her, because no one had planned for this. The exile was supposed to be a punishment. It was supposed to hurt. Instead, it had looked like a relief. 12 years after the vote, a young Vreth named Pri was given his first senior posting in the Galactic Accord. He was 31, which was young for a Vreth. Their lives were long, and their institutions promoted slowly. He was assigned to the Bureau of Economic Coordination, which was a polite name for the office that tried to figure out why things were getting worse. They were getting worse in ways that were hard to explain cleanly. The Accord's economic projections, built over centuries of careful modeling, adjusted and refined by some of the best minds in 12 species, had consistently predicted that the exile of humanity would cause a short period of adjustment, perhaps 10 to 20 years, followed by a return to normal. The models showed that the gaps humans left in trade and industry would be filled by the remaining member species working together. The models had been wrong. Pri spent his first 3 months reading reports. He read them in order, starting from the year of the exile, and he watched a slow, quiet disaster unfold across the pages. Not a dramatic disaster, no wars, no collapses, nothing that would make a good story. Just a long series of smaller problems that never quite got solved. The first thing to go wrong was medicine. Humans had been, for reasons that were only obvious in hindsight, very good at making medicine. Not just for themselves, for everyone. Their research programs had produced treatments and technologies that 30 other species depended on. When human space closed, those research programs stopped sharing results. New treatments stopped arriving. Old treatments started running short as manufacturing contracts ended. The Kalan had managed to rebuild their own pharmaceutical programs in about 8 years, which was faster than anyone expected. The smaller species had taken longer. Some were still not there yet. The second problem was security. Humans had been, again in hindsight, a surprisingly effective stabilizing force across a wide area of the galaxy. Not because they were the most powerful species, they were not, at the time of the exile, but because they were unpredictable in a way that made starting conflicts near their territory a risky calculation. When human space closed, the buffer they had represented disappeared. Small territorial disputes that might have been settled quietly now had no reason to stay quiet. 3 conflicts in the outer Accord systems had escalated to full military exchanges in the last 5 years. 2 were still ongoing. The third problem was harder to describe. Pri tried several times in his reports and was never quite satisfied with how he put it. The best version he managed was this: humans have been very good at solving problems that no one else wanted to touch. Difficult problems. Problems where the solution required doing something uncomfortable or moving faster than everyone else was comfortable moving. With humans gone, those problems tended to sit. The Accord was good at many things, but it was not good at urgency. Pre brought his findings to his section head, a senior Vreth named Ossian, who had been in the Bureau of Economic Coordination for 40 years. Ossian looked over the summary and nodded slowly, in the way of someone who is not surprised. "This has been building since year 2, Ossian said. "Why wasn't it addressed earlier?" Pre asked. Ossian set down the report. "Because admitting the problem means admitting that the Exile was a mistake. And admitting that requires a majority vote of the Senior Council. And the same species who voted for the Exile control the Senior Council." He paused. "So we write reports. And we wait. Wait for what? For it to get bad enough that pride becomes less important than survival." Across the Accord, a merchant named Ossie Mern was having a similar education, arriving at it through more personal means. Ossie ran a mid-sized trading operation that moved specialty goods between 7 systems. He had built his business over 20 years, largely on the strength of his human clients. Humans bought things in large quantities, paid reliably, and had an astonishing appetite for variety. They wanted things from everywhere, all the time, in quantities that kept his ships busy and his accounts comfortable. Without them, his business had shrunk by slightly more than half in 10 years. He had tried replacing the lost trade volume with other clients. He had been partially successful. The Luthari were good customers, and a new contract with a Kalan food distributor helped. Human clients had a specific quality that he had not been able to replace, which was that they were interested in everything. Other species had narrower tastes. They wanted their own goods, familiar goods, things that fit into patterns their civilization already understood. Humans wanted the strange thing from the edge of explored space. They wanted the ingredient that no one else knew how to use. They wanted the ore that was hard to refine, and the art that was hard to understand, and the technology that was still experimental, and probably had problems. He had not realized how much of his business model depended on that quality until it was gone. On a small orbital habitat above Mars, inside human space, a girl named Saya was 7 years old and learning about the galaxy in school. Her teacher, a kind man named Mr. Dan Adeyemi, was explaining that there were many other species of intelligent life in the universe, spread across hundreds of star systems, organized into a group called the Galactic Accord. "Do we talk to them?" Saya asked. "Not right now," Mr. Adeyemi said. "Why not?" He thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old. "A long time ago, they asked us to leave their group, so we left, and we've been building our own things since then." Saya thought about this. What kind of things? New homes on new planets, new ships, new science, a lot of new science. He smiled. "We've been busy." "Do you miss them?" Saya asked. Mr. Adeyemi considered the question genuinely, the way good teachers do when students ask something worth considering. "I think some people do," he said, "but most people have been too busy to miss much." Saya accepted this and went back to her drawing. She was drawing a star map. Her map had hundreds of stars on it, all connected by lines. All of them were inside human space, because that was the map she knew. The stars on the other side of the threshold were not on her map. They were not part of her sky. She did not think of this as a loss. She thought of it as simply the way things were. There was human space, which was large and growing and full of interesting things, and there was somewhere else, which was out past the door that closed before she was born. She had no particular feelings about the somewhere else. It was not her concern. This was perhaps the most significant thing happening in human space during these 12 years, though it was happening so quietly and naturally that no one was writing reports about it. A generation was growing up that did not have any memory of the Galactic Accord, for whom the Exile was not a wound or a humiliation, or even a political fact. It was just old history, like a country border that moved before you were born. The emotional weight of what had happened in that hall on Station Meridian was dissolving. The way all things dissolve when the people who lived through them are replaced by people who only read about them. What was not dissolving was the work, the building, the expansion. Human ships were reaching stars that had never been reached before. New colonies were going up on worlds that had been on survey lists for 40 years and never acted on, because the bureaucratic process of the Accord required 7 species to agree before any exploration could be approved. That process was gone now. If humans wanted to explore a system, they went. If they wanted to build a colony, they built it. If they wanted to test a new drive technology that the Accord's Safety Board would have required 12 years of review to approve, they tested it. Sometimes things went wrong. That was acceptable. You learned from what went wrong, and you went again. The pace was different now. That was the only way to describe it. The pace was completely different. And the stars ahead were getting closer every year. 40 years after the vote, a Luthari diplomatic vessel called the Quiet Passage sat at the edge of the threshold barrier and waited. The ship had been waiting for 11 days, not because it had encountered any mechanical problem or navigational difficulty, but because that was how long it had taken for someone on the other side to respond to its hailing frequency. Ambassador Gen Ilara stood at the front observation window of the Quiet Passage and looked at the barrier. It was not visible exactly. You could not see a quantum lock field with your eyes, but there was a quality to the sensor readings, a kind of density in the data, that the navigation system displayed as a faint curved line on its overlay screen. That told you something was there, something deliberate, something that had been placed there with great care and great patience and had not moved in 40 years. Ilara was the Accord's best choice for this mission, and everyone who had chosen her knew it. The Luthari had abstained from the original Exile vote. Their hands were cleaner than most. Ilara herself had built her career on careful diplomacy and a talent for sitting quietly in difficult rooms until she understood them. She had been told before departure that her mission was to open a conversation, not to negotiate. That was premature. Just to establish that a conversation was possible. She had not been told that it would take 11 days to receive acknowledgement that her ship existed. When the response finally came, it was from a human border monitoring station about 800,000 kilometers inside the barrier. The voice was professional and calm. A woman's voice. Quiet Passage. This is Threshold Station 7. We have your identification and your diplomatic registration. A border officer will be in contact within 30 standard cycles to discuss the terms under which dialogue may be considered. Please maintain your current position. Do not attempt to cross the boundary line. The message ended. Ilara stood at her window for a long moment. Then she sat down and wrote in her log. They said terms. Humanity is setting terms. She underlined the word twice. 30 standard cycles was just over 3 weeks. Ilara waited. Her ship was well supplied. She had brought books. On the other side of the threshold, Commander Petra Solis Nkembe received the file on the Luthari diplomatic request and read it over lunch. She was 34, third-generation post-exile, born on a colony world in the Kepler system that had not even been named when the exile happened. Her grandmother had been a diplomat. Her grandfather had been an admiral. She had gone into border services because she liked the particular combination of routine and sudden importance that came with it. Most days were quiet. Occasionally, something arrived at your door. Today, something had arrived at her door. She sent a query to Elder Affairs, a small office within the human government that maintained records on all pre-exile history and the people who had lived through it. Elder Affairs was in contact with a retired diplomat named Serena Voss, who was living on a residential habitat in Martian orbit, and was, apparently, still quite alert at 91. The reply from Elder Affairs came back within an hour. It contained a brief note, written in a clear, unadorned style that Petra immediately liked. Let them knock. Answer when you are ready, not before. Be polite. Be unhurried. Show them what 40 years looks like. Petra scheduled a communication window for the Luthari ambassador. She scheduled it 18 days out, because she had other work to do, and because 18 days was a perfectly reasonable amount of time, and because she thought the gap would communicate something that words might not. When the window opened, she took the call from her office. She was professionally dressed, as she always was. The background behind her was her normal working environment. Screens, data displays, a star map on the wall. She had not cleaned up for the occasion, because this was just work. Ambassador Ilara appeared on her screen. She looked older than her official photographs, which Petra had reviewed before the call. 40 years of difficult work aged a person, whatever species they were. Commander Solis Nkembe, Ilara said, "Thank you for accepting this communication." "Of course," Petra said. "How can I help you?" Ilara was experienced enough not to show surprise at the directness, though it was not what she had been expecting. She had prepared for a formal opening, an exchange of official greetings, a slow diplomatic warm-up. Instead, she had been asked how she could be helped, as if she were a visitor inquiring about services. She delivered the message she had been sent to deliver. The Galactic Accord wished to discuss the possibility of renegotiating humanity's status. There were shared concerns: security, trade, cooperation on scientific matters of mutual importance. The Accord recognized that time had passed and circumstances had changed. It was willing to discuss new arrangements. Petra listened to all of it. She made a note on her screen partway through, the content of which Ilara could not see. When the message was finished, Petra said, "Thank you, Ambassador. We'll have someone review the request. It may be some time. We've been busy." "I understand," Ilara said. "May I ask, what should I tell the Council about the timeline?" "Tell them we'll be in touch," Petra said pleasantly. There was a pause. Ilara glanced, just for a moment, at the star map visible on the wall behind Petra. She had been trained to observe details in communication environments. The star map caught her attention because it was not small. It covered most of the wall, and the density of marked systems on it, the sheer number of named, catalogued, apparently inhabited or settled points of light, was not what she had been expecting from human space as she remembered it. "Commander," she said carefully, "that map behind you, is that current?" Petra turned and looked at the map with the mild interest of someone looking at something they see every day. "Yes," she said, "updated last month." Ilara stared at it. She had looked at human space in the Accord's records. The last records were 40 years old. In those records, humanity controlled or had settled approximately 31 star systems. What she was looking at on Petra's wall had, by rough count, somewhere between 150 and 200 marked points. She could not be certain. The map was partially obscured, and she was working from a communication screen. It was not a rounding error. "You've been busy," Ilara said softly. "We mentioned that," Petra said, and she was not being unkind about it. She was simply being accurate. After the communication ended, Ilara sat alone in the forward cabin of the quiet passage for a long time. She had come here with a message. She had delivered it. The message had been received with complete and unhurried politeness and no urgency whatsoever. She had been told that someone would be in touch. She did not doubt that this was true. She was also quite aware that in touch and soon were not the same thing, and that the entity she had just spoken to on behalf of had no particular reason to hurry. She sent her report to the Accord Council. She wrote it clearly and without softening the facts. The human government had received the Accord's message. They would respond in their own time. Their space was significantly larger than current Accord records indicated. Their border services personnel were polite, efficient, and appeared entirely unbothered by the existence of the Galactic Accord. She added one final observation. because she believed in complete reporting even when the observation was uncomfortable. She wrote, "There was no anger in the response, no bitterness, no sign that the exile was a wound that still needed to heal. This is perhaps more significant than any other detail in this report. They have not been waiting for us to apologize. They have not been waiting for us at all." Back on Station Meridian, when the report arrived, Archon Pre, now 43, and senior enough to see reports like this one, read it 3 times. Then he set it down, and sat with the particular feeling of someone who has just understood something they should have understood much earlier, and cannot undo the time they spent not understanding it. 100 years after the vote, the Galactic Accord did not exist anymore. This was not the result of a war or a dramatic collapse. It had ended the way most things end, when the reasons for their existence slowly disappear. It had simply become less and less necessary, until the member species had, one by one, quietly stopped attending the sessions that no one was calling anyway. The final official session of the Grand Conclave had taken place 11 years earlier, with 9 species present, none of them from the original founding group. The record showed that the session had lasted 4 hours and had accomplished nothing. Then the station had been decommissioned, and the staff had gone home. Chancellor Amara Vasa Conquo was the 3rd Chancellor of the Terran Hegemony, which was the name humanity had given to its government once Earth's government had become too small a phrase for what it was governing. The hegemony now spanned 217 settled star systems, with active exploration programs running in 60 more. It had a population in the billions, spread across dozens of worlds. A fleet that was the largest and most technically sophisticated in the known galaxy. And a reputation, built slowly and carefully over a century, of being precisely as predictable as it chose to be, as an entity that kept its agreements and did not suffer being lied to. Amara was 55. She had her great-grandmother Serena's gray eyes, and her great-grandfather Dara's straightforward way of occupying a room. The quality of a person who knows exactly where they are and is comfortable there. She had spent 20 years in the hegemony's scientific research division before moving into governance, which meant she had a specific habit of looking at problems and asking what the actual evidence said before deciding what to do about them. She received her visitors in the hall of the closed door. The hall was a wide, high-ceilinged space on Meridian Station, not the old Accord Station, which was gone, but a new one, built by humanity about 60 years ago as a neutral meeting point near the edge of Terran space. The hall took its name from the recording that was displayed on one long wall, a full-length, high-resolution recording of Serena Voss walking out of the original Grand Conclave session. The recording was about 40 seconds long. It showed her listening to the result of the vote, standing, walking to the podium, smiling, saying her 12 words, picking up her datapad, and leaving. Then it looped. When visitors from other species first entered the hall, they usually looked at the recording for a long time. Some found it uncomfortable. Some found it interesting. A few had told Amara privately that they found it quietly inspiring, which was an opinion she appreciated for its honesty. She had explained to all of them that the hall was not meant as a statement of superiority, or a way of rubbing past events into anyone's face. It was simply a record, a reminder of where humanity had come from, and what had been done with the time since. The first visitor of the year arrived on a cool morning in the station's artificial climate cycle. He was old, very old by Vreth standards, which meant he had been born not long after the exile, and had lived his entire life in its shadow. His name was Pre, and he was the former head of the Accord's Bureau of Economic Coordination, and he had spent 30 years writing reports about things going wrong, and being told to keep writing reports. He walked into the hall slowly, because his legs did not work as well as they had. He stopped in front of the recording, and watched it for a while. Serena Voss crossed the floor. She smiled, she spoke, She left. The doors closed. The recording looped. Amara met him at the center of the room and offered the standard greeting of the hegemony's diplomatic protocol. A slight inclination of the head, hands visible and open. Pri returned it in the Vreth manner, 4 eyes meeting hers in sequence. "I have wanted to see this room for a long time," he said. "You're welcome to it," Amara said. They sat at the table near the center of the hall. Pri had no formal delegation, no official portfolio. He was here as himself, as a Vreth who had spent a long life studying a mistake, and felt, at the end of that life, that he ought to say something about it to someone who deserved to hear it. "We thought we were removing a threat," he said. He had said these words many times in speeches and reports over the years, but this was the first time he had said them in this room, to a person from the species in question. "We did not understand what we were releasing." Amara looked at him for a moment. She had read about Pri. He was one of the few voices inside the Accord's later years who had consistently said, in plain language, that the Exile had been a mistake. He had said it when it was unpopular. He had kept saying it after it stopped being unpopular and became simply obvious. She respected that kind of consistency. "You gave us the greatest gift you could have," she said. "You gave us no ceiling." Pri was quiet for a moment. "That was not what we intended." "I know," she said, "but it's what happened." He looked at the recording on the wall again. Serena Voss was leaving. Again. She left, and the doors closed, and the recording restarted, and she left again. An infinite departure, looping quietly in a room that had not existed when the departure first happened. "The other species," Pri said, "the ones who are asking to meet, what will you tell them?" "The same thing I'm telling you," Amara said. "We're open to new arrangements, equal ones. Not the Accords model. We're not interested in being the junior member of anything. But we are interested in neighbors. Trade, shared research, mutual defense where interests align. Things that are good for everyone involved." "And if they ask about what happened, about the vote?" "I'll point them at that wall," Amara said, "and let them watch it. Then I'll tell them that what you see in that recording is not an ending. It's a starting point. Everything we've built came after those doors closed. We don't need anyone to feel bad about the past. We just need everyone to be honest about the present." Pri nodded slowly. It was the nod of someone who had expected something harder and found themselves unexpectedly grateful for what they received instead. The other visitors came over the following weeks and months, not in a block, not with a grand gesture. That era was over. They came one at a time or in small groups, each arriving in the hall of the closed door, and each spending some time in front of the recording before sitting down at the table. The Luthari came early, and their ambassador wept quietly during the meeting, which Amara did not comment on. The Kalan sent a young diplomat, who asked more questions than she answered, which Amara thought was a good sign. Several smaller species arrived who had not been significant players in the original Exile, and simply wanted good trade agreements, which were straightforward to work out. Each meeting followed the same basic shape. The visitor acknowledged the past, in whatever way their culture handled such things. Amara acknowledged that the past was past. Then they talked about the future in practical terms, what each side needed, what each side could offer, what kind of relationship made sense going forward. None of the meetings were dramatic. None of them needed to be. The last visitor of the year was a small delegation from a species Amara had never heard of. They were from the far edge of what had been Accord space, and their civilization was young. They had achieved space travel only 80 years ago. They had no part in anything that had happened a century before. They simply knew that the Terran hegemony was the largest, most advanced, and most reliably functioning civilization in the galaxy, and they wanted to introduce themselves. They arrived in a ship that was, by hegemony standards, quite modest. They were nervous, which was obvious in the way they arranged themselves, and the way their leader kept checking the translation device as if worried it would fail. They had dressed formally for the occasion. They had brought a gift, which was a small object carved from a mineral found only on their homeworld. Amara received it with both hands and set it carefully on the table where she could see it. They did not know about the Exile. They did not know about Serena Voss, or the Vote, or the Bureau of Severance, or the Threshold Project. All of that was old history, from before their civilization had looked up at the stars and started building ships to reach them. They knew only that humanity was out here, and had been here a long time, and seemed like the kind of neighbor worth meeting. Amara listened to their introduction, and then introduced herself and her team in return. She asked questions about their homeworld, their government, their science programs. She was genuinely interested in the answers, because she always was. One of the things people said about her, and had said about her great-grandmother before her, was that the interest was always real. It was not diplomatic technique. It was just how humans were, always wanting to know what the next thing was, always turning toward whatever was new and asking what it was made of. At the end of the meeting, the young delegation's leader looked around the hall one last time before leaving. His eyes rested on the recording for a moment. The gray-haired woman walking out of a door that no longer existed, into a future that had turned out better than anyone watching her leave could have guessed. "What is that?" he asked. "The beginning," Amara said. Then he turned to face her, and behind him, on the wall, the doors of the old conclave swung shut one more time, quiet and final, and full of everything that came after.